I'm one of those persons of the opinion that we find the universal in our specific stories, right? By telling you my specific story, whoever you are, you can recognize our common humanity.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Empire Podcast interviews, where we like to interview everyone from pastors to actors, rappers to trappers, and everybody in between. And yes, we have another great guest. But before we get into it, don't forget the usual. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. We're trying to build it up. You know, the usual, blah, 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 blah. And we appreciate you guys. But let's get right into our amazing guest. Poet from, can we say... South Central, can we say that?
Yeah, you can say that. Yes, you can say South Central.
Mr. Yusef.
That's right.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Gotcha. How was your day?
The day has been the morning, and the
Okay.
morning has been lovely. It was a really nice drive out. Didn't really hit any bad traffic, considering, right? And just a little bit coming through downtown L.A., and even that was smooth in relation to what it could be. So quite lovely. Enjoyed the snow-capped mountains on my drive out, all that. So
Gotcha. Yeah. Thank goodness there was no traffic. So there's snow-capped mountains, you said?
yeah.
Okay.
The San Gabriel's had some on them. The San Bernardino's got some snow on them. Mount Baldy, I think Mount Jurupa, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a beautiful time right now. It's a really beautiful time out here. I'm not sure how it's been on your weather end of the day, but over here in the Dirty Dino, it's been windy pretty recently. It's been like crazy windy. I'm not sure how it is in LA right now.
Not super windy. I mean, we've been getting, the cooler weather, the wet weather, and the little pocket where we live, we do get wind, but we're a little bit up on a hill. So I think we're just getting the wind that blows anyway because it's a little higher up. So no unusual winds, right, where I think the trees might fall down or branches fall, anything like that. Right?
Nothing terrorist, basically.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Yusef, how do you say your last name again?
Doucet.
Doucet.
Yes, Doucet.
French, right?
Right. Family from Louisiana, father's family.
Gotcha. Well, speaking of such greatness, can you tell us all, Yusef, who you are and what you do?
Who I am and what I do. Well, I am Yusef, Yusef Doucet. When I'm at work teaching composition and literature at Santa Monica College for, about 24 years now. I'm primarily known as Will. First three letters of my first name, Wilfred. But at home and in my life as an artist, Yusef, right? And most people call me Yusef. Of course, my mother calls me Wilfred, right? Because that's my mom. And Yusef is my middle name, right? So it's not like I took a name, right?
Got you.
Right?
Got you.
My middle name. Born and raised in Los Angeles, lifelong Californian. I appreciate being where we are right now in San Bernardino. As I mentioned to you, I'm a graduate of Cal State San Bernardino, former resident of Colton. My mother moved us out here in the very early 80s. She was part of that exodus, that black exodus out of L.A. into the Inland Empire in the 80s. So, very familiar with the area. I think of myself as a cultural worker. So as I mentioned, right, I teach English at Santa Monica College. I am a poet. I've been a self-declared poet. I think 8th grade was when I decided I was a poet and started writing poetry. Got published for the first time, I think as a 19-year-old. That sounds about right, 19 or 20. And so just been kind of doing that thing, right, over, mainly here in California. publishing here and there, primarily doing performances. Places like the World Stage. We actually did some performances out here, Cal State San Bernardino at times. Different events around Pomona Arts Colony. Over the years, working with other poets, other artists, formed an artist collective, the Ubwenge Artist Collective. Ubwenge is a word that means active intelligence. I forget the specific language it comes from, and I don't want to guess. Right?
Gotcha,
Since I don't, since I can't remember exactly, but I do remember it means active intelligence, a group of artists that we were based here in San Bernardino, in the San Bernardino area when we were founded. We met at Cal State San Bernardino. So over the years, right, different projects that we've put on. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, live in Los Angeles. For years, we put on programs at the City Market Gallery of Los Angeles, a gallery that used to be, well, the building is still there, in the Fashion District in downtown Los Angeles. It's just this really old building, right, classic building. I think it has... or at least the sign on top of the building has historical status, right? We were able to put on great shows there. A good friend of mine, artist friend of mine, she has a studio there, and then periodically we would be able to get the gallery, right, for exhibits, and whenever she got the gallery, she'd come to me, I got it for this long, what do you want to do with it, right? So we would put on poetry readings, small theatrical performances, things like that, showcase things like that.
All right.
Now, a year and a few months ago, after an adult life, being a poet and publishing in various journals, etc., I finally put a collection together to have my first volume of poetry published. So that was November 2021 that it was published. The Black Dot. Actually, there's no "the" in the title, just Black Dot Clubhouse.
Does the title have a meaning? Yeah.
The Black Dot concept, I was introduced to as an undergraduate in the Black Studies program at San Francisco State University. And one of my instructors, Dr. Richard King, a Los Angeles-based psychiatrist who was coming up to teach a class every week, he wrote several articles on the Black Dot, right, in a journal that I don't think exists anymore. It was called the Urias Journal. And the Urias is that I believe it's the cobra symbol that comes out of the pharaoh's crown when you look at the ancient Egyptian.
Okay.
So meaning the third eye, right?
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
A reference to the third eye. And again, he as a psychiatrist was, looking at the, researching the pineal gland, right?
Yeah.
The pineal gland. So he writes about the black dot, right? And he describes the black dot as this symbol, and nothing fancy about it, right? It's a dot. But the symbol for all the potentiality, right, of the universe, right? So that black dot represents the seed of humanity.
Okay.
The door to the unconscious, the deep oceans of the universe, right, of outer space. The inner world, right, of the human. So all of these various things, right, all of these various potentialities that are contained in that black dot, or another way of thinking of it, that singularity, right, that becomes the Big Bang, so to speak.
Interesting.
So, yeah, and it resonated with me, right? That just really resonated with me. I enjoyed doing the readings. And so back from that time, I had the idea of Black Dot, and another poet friend and I, we wanted to to start a literary journal, a literary art journal called the Black Dot Journal.
Yeah. What year was it when you heard the Black Dot the first time?
This is like probably 1986 and or 7, right around that time. And probably we moved there in 86, so it's probably 87 when I think I took that class. No, it was 86 because I was still, I can remember based on where I lived, and I was still living on Tapia right by the college. So yeah, it was 86 when I first learned of it. And within a couple of years, we wanted to do this thing. But a couple of things happened, right? We gathered our materials for the first edition, but then my man got married, moved a little further out from where we were.
Yeah.
I got married, and we decided to move to Southern California. And so we were never able to complete the project, but it always stayed with me. And so then I just decided to use the title for my own collection of work.
Okay. So as being a poet, why is poetry so important to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And well, for me, right, it's life, right? There are these things, these ideas, these voices, this way of seeing the world. And it's got to come out, right? And I've been what we used to call, I don't hear the term that much anymore, but I've been a bookworm since a little kid.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
Loved reading books. My parents, working class parents, they provided books for me. Now, I think it helped. It helped a lot that
so we're in the right place.
We are definitely in the right place. And I'm loving the books I'm seeing on the shelves around here. We had a cousin who worked for the L.A. Public Library.
Okay.
And when they would get rid of old books, she would send them to the house. So we had a nice shelf of books. So that's kind of how it got started, me reading the books. I actually enjoyed reading the Mother Goose rhymes when I was a little kid. I enjoyed the musicality of the rhymes and that they told stories, right? And
yeah.
So I had an affinity for poetry really kind of early on. Our seventh grade English teacher taught us various poetry forms, and we needed to, and we created little booklets, right, of our original poems. So I embraced that completely. That was 7th grade. The previous year, 6th grade, I have a distinct memory of lessons in using similes. And I enjoyed that, right? Mm-hmm. Creating these pictures with words. So by the time...
Can you give just maybe for some of the audience that may not know, can you give us an example of what a simile is?
I sure can. A simile, and people use these all the time, right? So there's nothing mysterious about them. A simile is when a person makes an indirect comparison between two unlike things. So for example, Jimmy swims like a fish. That's a simile.
Boom.
There you go, right? So, or the metaphor, Jimmy is a fish, right? Okay. Whereas the direct comparison, right? So any simile can be turned into a metaphor. Any metaphor can be turned to a simile, just adding, just making it indirect. And I remember writing something like the sound of the bells raced through the church like horses, something like that, right? And I thought, this is fun. And I think this was at Transfiguration Catholic School in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Archdiocese. And at that time, I just felt like we got a really great language arts instruction. As I remember this very specific technique that the teachers used. Seemed like 4th through 6th grade, we would get vocabulary words, right? And Monday night's homework was to go look up the words. So you turn in the definitions. Tuesday night's homework was to use the words, each word in a sentence. And then Wednesday night's homework was to use either all the words or half of them in a story you wrote. And so we were constantly writing stories.
Okay.
And I was having a great time doing that stuff, right? So that already liking books, reading a lot, and then that kind of instruction, I realized that I like it, had a capacity for it, decided to do some writing on my own, of course, kind of in secret.
Yes.
Would do it in my parents' room. One day I forgot my notebook in there. And then the next day my mother comes to me and says, "Oh, I like the stuff you're writing, right? You've got some talent." Of course, I was mortified, right? That she had seen my work. Like, oh my gosh, this
like you sneaking behind my book? Like you sneaking through my work? Like
Right.
what's going on, Ma?
But at the same time, I appreciated the encouragement. Like, that's good, but man, I wish you hadn't read it. Now, there wasn't anything in it as a seventh grader, but it was just oh no, my internal world has been exposed to my parents. So.
She's like, what is my son talking about?
Right, right.
Okay, horses and church bells. Okay, we're safe.
We're cool.
Yeah,
right,
we're safe.
Exactly.
We're
exactly. But that was it. That was really the beginning, and I decided then, I think, and that you could be a poet, right? I knew of Langston Hughes. Also critical that year, and this was probably 8th grade. Audubon Junior High School, when it was called Junior High School before middle school. My aunt, my mother's sister, she had a collection, the collected works of Robert Frost. So I picked that up and started reading it, and it's like, wow, I just loved it. And so, it occurred to me that this is something you could do, right? You could grow up to be a poet. So I became a poet. I decided I'm a poet. And when I would try to write, at a certain point, I thought, well, I want to write a story, but it would start coming out as a poem.
Okay. Every time?
Every time.
Gotcha.
So I didn't fight it.
That's smart. Don't fight it. Yeah.
You're a poet, right?
Yeah.
So and the stuff has to come out.
That's what I say when I meet girls. Don't fight it. Just a joke.
That's good. It's good. You don't want anybody fighting it.
So did I cut you off?
No, no.
So, I understand the importance of it as a youth. Mm-hmm. How is it important to you as an adult right now? And why is it important to you as an adult right now?
It is my primary form of artistic communication. My primary way of commenting on the world and experience, of reaching out to other souls. And I think it's really fundamental to my own sense of who I am.
Gotcha.
Right? It's part of how I understand myself and my walk right through the world. And for me, I actually wrote, because I was early in my life as a writer, I was an extensive journal writer until I didn't need to be anymore.
Okay.
And which was just kind of like, I just couldn't do it anymore. It's like, well, okay, I guess I don't need to do this unless my body is like, no, you don't need, I'm just listening to my body. But I remember writing in one of those entries that it felt like poetry was less about a particular way of writing than it was about a way of seeing the world.
Okay.
Seeing the world and walking through the world, right? And that poetic vision counted the most. And that might be translated into, the way a person makes a film or something, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So that the vision was really the key thing. And part of that vision, a really important aspect of that vision, was the connectedness of things, right?
Gotcha. And it kind of like goes in to my next question, which is, how has poetry shaped your life, and how do you think it affects other people's lives?
Since youth, since my 20s, I've heard people say, and I agree, poetry can save lives. Whether and I'm thinking of the poet's life first, right?
Okay.
Whether the writer is thinking about sharing the work at all. You got to get some things out, right? It's a way of dealing with yourself, right? And being in conversation with that internal self, right? I mean, what is, man, woman, know thyself. And so it's a path to that self-knowledge, which again, the internal, there's that dynamic relationship between the internal and the external. And as I'm learning more about myself, I'm learning more about you. And even if I don't know, specific details about you, I should at least recognize in you the common humanity I recognize in me.
Yeah.
Triumphs and defeats, all that, right? That we are all those things, and the incredible beauty, the sublime that we can achieve, and the depths. And it keeps me grounded in the knowledge that when I see the best of us as human beings, there go I. But just as importantly, when I see the worst of us as human beings, there also go I.
Period.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and that is a lesson that poetry constantly gives me that I think it can give others. I don't, the audience for poetry, it varies, I guess, depending on where you are, right? And
even the type of poetry.
And even the type of poetry.
Yeah.
But I think the folks who, whether they write it or not, or just, love to hear it, right? That they're vibing there some kind of way, right? They're recognizing that human connection, their story being told, even if it isn't their exact story, the ability to recognize themselves and others in what the poet has to say.
That makes sense. And, you talked earlier about performing your poetry in various locations. So how would you describe the difference between performing your poetry and just having your poetry be on paper and let other people read? And do you ever think that people interpret it the way you say it, the way it's written down? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense.
Okay.
I want to start with the second part first, the interpretation. I think there are sometimes, there are meanings in the pieces, there are meanings in the poem that the poet may not even be aware of, right? Because a reader or an audience hears something and it makes meaning out of it, right? And because of whatever resonates in their life. So we can't control the interpretations, and we should be careful not to. I'm always willing to say, someone asks, well, what were you talking about? Yeah, I'll tell you the story of the poem, right?
Yeah.
But if you thought something different, that's cool, right? That's that's perfectly valid.
Their
right?
interpretation.
That's perfectly, because I know I've done that, right? Oh, I felt like it was saying this, and I wasn't even thinking of that, but yeah, I can see that, right? So that part of it, right? I think audiences, the audience, and in fact, the audience completes the meaning of the piece, right?
Gotcha.
Whatever the film, the sculpture, the piece of art, audience brings something to it. And again, might be the final step, right, in the completion of the piece.
Yep.
In which case, you and I read the same poem and we complete different poems, right, because of our own particular interaction with it. Now, the first part of your question, it's interesting. As a teacher of poetry, I like to emphasize, I don't know if that's the right word, but I do make the point that I think the poem needs to work in both places.
Okay.
It needs to work orally, right? It's got to sound good. Poetry is not written simply for the page, right? Poetry is written to be recited.
Okay.
But it also has to work on the page,
Okay.
right? For the person, when you aren't reciting it and that person is reading it, does it work on the page? One of my friends and colleagues from the Joko Collective, and also a graduate of Cal State San Bernardino, Lisa Marie Rollins, a playwright, poet, director, she's now based in Denver. She and I would talk about this, right? We would talk about, one, we didn't want to be mediocre, right?
Okay.
Right?
No one wants to be mediocre.
Don't want to be mediocre. Wanted to achieve some kind of
mediocre.
greatness with this stuff. But then the other, and then in that vein, right? This was the 90s. Slam poetry was very popular at the time. The spoken word, right? And we're like, yeah, sometimes a really good performance is masking not that great of poetry, right? The writing is really mediocre, but the performance is dynamic.
Yep.
So, okay, cool on that. But what happens when the performer isn't there and I'm just reading it, right?
Yeah.
Then what's going to happen? So I do write with that in mind. When somebody's reading this and I'm not reading it, right? Is it going to work, right? Are they going to get the impact, so to speak, be moved by it? Now, the editor of the editor publisher for World Stage Press, and World Stage Press published published Black Dot Clubhouse. And as we were going through like the final, sort of editing session, making sure, and he said something, of course, that I'm not thinking about, right? And this is Hiram Sims, also a former colleague from Santa Monica College. I think he's still teaching at Long Beach, either Long Beach State or Long Beach City. I can't remember which Long Beach. But he's also, right, he also made that decision. You know what? You can be a poet, so I'm going to become a poet. And he and his wife have opened a new institution in Los Angeles, the Sims Library of Poetry.
Okay.
And it's a cool on Florence and 5th, South L.A., very cool. And in our last editing session, he made the point. He's like, look, this is what I want you to keep in mind, because we were talking about where to put in punctuation or not, right? Because he's, not all poets like to put in punctuation. He's like, I can work with that, but I want you to think about the reader. And he said, this is what I want you to think about, or at least this is what I think about. When somebody is reading your poetry out of the book, I want them to be able to read it the way you would read it if you were reciting.
Exactly.
Right? So,
exactly.
And that's what the punctuation helps with. So I really took that to heart. And, in making those final changes for, for the publication, and then subsequently poetry I've written since then, I'm keeping that in mind in a way that I didn't before. When people are reading this on the page, are they going to read it the way I would read it?
Yeah, how you would
or at
say
least as close as possible.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And that resonated with me again because of a poem that I often read to my class. Ego tripping. There must be a reason why. Nikki Giovanni. And I read it in a particular way, and I like my reading of it. Right. I do.
Yeah.
But then I saw her read it once, and I was like, oh, I don't read it anything like that. And I actually like my reading more than Nikki Giovanni's. But then again, she's been reading it for, how long? Her entire life. And by the time I saw her read it, the poem was probably already 40 years old, if not older. But that too was illuminating. Like, okay, yeah, even like actors who may want to interpret the poem theatrically will have a different reading than the poet may.
Yes, sir.
So, that answer your question?
Yeah, I believe it does. And what's also interesting is that, like, as artists, we know that a lot of artists are really introverted.
Mm-hmm.
So I can imagine for some poets, they wouldn't be able to, or even want to perform their poetry live because they're just like, no, I'm too shy. I don't want to do it. And so I think it's like a two-way double-edged sword. Some people might be, like you said, with the slam poets, really animated, and catching your attention, but they're just like not giving you much. And there might be people who are just super introverted, but their words are just like, wow, this is powerful.
Believe it or not, that's me, the introverted poet.
Okay.
So I actually don't do a lot of readings. I did many more when I was in my 20s and 30s. And even then, it's like, kind of a nervous wreck about performing. And I love it when once the performance starts and when it's over, I'm in it and I'm loving it. All the time leading up to it, I'm just like a nervous wreck. And that's the part I don't like, which is why I don't perform that often, though now I'm much more comfortable than I used to be.
Gotcha.
So
experience, right?
Makes a big difference.
I actually heard something really good, and I really love the term, like, because they said that nerves happen before a performance is because you want to do good.
Exactly.
So it's like being nervous is not a bad thing. It's a good thing because you want to give the best quality performance you possibly can.
Exactly.
Yep.
Means you care.
Yeah, that's so we should start looking at our nerves in a good thing. That's like, hey, we want to represent ourselves and our product the best way as possible.
That's right.
Another thing that I wanted to say is that, and I heard this recently, or not recently, but years ago, we should be not only sharing our work, but while we're here on earth, like exposing our work as much as possible, because there's only one of you, Yusef.
That's
we
right.
won't be able to hear. We can always assume how to interpret your poems, but only you can truly give us, this is how I would have. It may have said, Mary, it may say Mary had ran down the story. I know it's improper English, but it could be like, Mary had ran down. It's just.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so many. And so I honestly believe that while we're here on earth, all artists, all people, share it while you can. And I remember hearing a story about a woman who I believe it was a woman, she passed away, and they found under her bed like just manuscripts and manuscripts of like poetry and work that she never shared with anybody.
Sounds like Emily Dickinson.
Okay.
Yeah, which I'm totally on board with you on that, right? Get the word out, right?
Okay, yeah. Share your art.
Share your art.
Yeah,
because I always write with an audience in mind, even if I don't know when or where I might read it or publish it. I always write it with the notion that someone's going to read this or hear this at some point. Right?
Yeah.
That this is not just for me, right? But for someone out there. Yeah, that sounds like Emily Dickinson, one of my favorite poets.
Okay.
Who did have a public life at one time, had gotten some work published. But then, and I think the story goes after a heartbreak, some cad from San Francisco that broke her heart.
Okay.
She retreat. Now, I don't know if that's all there is to it.
Some playboy got her.
Exactly.
Like,
She retreats into her room, basically becomes a total introvert, and is writing all this poetry that after her death, her sister and brother-in-law go in to clean out the room and find all these poems, which is why a lot of the poetry of Emily Dickinson, when you see it in when it's republished or put into anthologies, either the title is either the first line of the poem or it's given a number. And it's the numbers, right? I think her sister and brother-in-law numbered them because they were untitled. And then subsequent editors have given them titles by using. So you'll see them, the same poem might be called number 312 or whatever that title of that poem is.
The first
right?
line of
whatever the first line is. So that sounds like Emily Dickinson.
It could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be related. You said something that's very interesting, which was about you write with an audience in mind, right? And I honestly believe, and this is just my opinion, that all art is community art. Like it's a two-way beautiful streak, and I can only thank our creator for this, which is that we create art to express ourselves, but it's also a means to help share with the communitad, right? And so I always believe, whether people are saying, I'm writing this just for me and I keep it to me, but it goes back to that woman not sharing. You can help somebody, like we mentioned earlier, help somebody by just reading your poem or seeing your art,
Reading
or
the poems.
et cetera,
That's right.
et cetera. And so I always believe in art being not only helping the individual, also helping the community.
Art is for the community.
Yeah.
I'm totally with you on that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you can do it for yourself, but it's so much more fun with someone else. Right?
Definitely.
So,
I think it's definitely a good place to start with self, because that's the natural truth. And then as it comes outward, other people could probably relate and be like, hey, man, or hey, lady, you do great work. And it touched me.
It touched me.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
Not in that
that's
way
what we
either,
wanna
people,
do.
you sickos.
Well, sometimes in that way later, because people are so
Got you. I got you there. I guess there is erotic fiction, I guess.
There is, yes.
There's 50 Shades of Grey for a reason.
Yes.
Yeah. Sickos.
And yeah, erotic art.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's good stuff.
Yeah, we went there. So, Yusef, as you mentioned, there's so many different styles of poetry, genres of poetry. How would you define your style of poetry?
That's a really tough question. Interesting. I'm not sure I know how to answer it. You might need a reader of the work. Well, I would say, I can say this. A lot of the poetry is political, right? Political commentary. I do see myself as coming through a tradition, and specifically the African American literary tradition. So I use that language.
When you say political, what do you mean? You're like, hey, vote Republican?
Well,
go ahead. Don't sugarcoat it.
I'm going to give you a really good answer.
Okay.
And no, not typically, because my politics are revolutionary.
Okay.
Or at least mostly revolutionary. So, really a politic that tries to uplift people and, uplift the common people in particular, tries to give voice to the experiences of the poor, the disenfranchised, the reservationed, the enslaved, the imprisoned, etc. That tries to speak for the earth, right? So there's that type of politic. A politic that wants to point the finger at the perpetrator, right? So poems that seek to call out police
brutality.
Yeah, violence was the word I was looking for, and the word I was holding back was militarization.
Yeah, don't hold back.
And mainly
here,
because it seemed redundant, though, to say police and militarization. Police they are military. So
they're militarizing them definitely.
Right. So that's why because it felt redundant. But yeah, so abuses of power, right? Abuses of power. But even like, those private abuses of power, right? That abuse of power within relationships, within friendships. So, that notion that the personal is also the political, right? So what are those power dynamics? So there's that, there's that political part of my poetry. I have a spiritual side, and that comes out in the poetry.
Got you.
What does it mean,
Yeah, I hear the word. I've been hearing the word spiritual all my life, and I think there's like a whole spectrum.
Yeah.
What does spiritual mean to you?
Well, again, that gets back to, for me, right? That rather than an otherworldliness, it's really more of an immersion into the connectedness of the world in which we live, right?
Okay.
The lines of connection between living beings, the living earth, right? When I meditate on the scientific physics reality that we really are made of star stuff, right? That we are stardust, that all this is stardust. I mean, I love that notion, right?
Yeah.
The connection between the living, the dead,
Yes.
the unborn, that we form one human community, right? So the invisibles are with us, right? Just because the thing is invisible doesn't mean it isn't. Various practices of spirit path, many of the various traditional religious practices make their way into my poetry.
Because you were raised in the Catholic, right?
I was raised Catholic, and I absolutely use Catholic prayers or forms in poetry, and really combine them. So a poem that I have performed often, and is in Black Dot Clubhouse, Rosary for the Revolutionary Madonna.
Okay.
Right. So, and it's a poem that looks to revolutionary women. Right. This sort of, let's reimagine Madonna and Child, but it's a poem inspired by a very particular image. I think the poster is called Bush Mama, and there have been various versions of it. The version I had that inspired the poem, along with other things going on, but that was real central to it. The image of the African woman with a baby at her breast and an AK-47 on her shoulder.
Okay.
And it's Bush Mama, which I didn't know at the time that's what it was called. And I had seen several versions of it, right? I think the African version is the original. I've seen a version with a Latin American woman. I've seen a version with an Arab woman. I've seen a version with an East Asian woman.
Okay.
The
multi-continental.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that inspired, so that notion, right? As I called it, since I didn't know it was called Bush Mama, I called it the Revolutionary Madonna.
Okay.
And wrote a poem around it, right?
Cool.
Our spirituality, our spirit, right, is, for me, right, it's rooted in the earth, in the universe, in that black dot.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of what it means to me, right? And that
Gotcha.
all of these various human paths, whether it's traditional, indigenous spirit traditions, or these religions of the book, right? Whether the three major Abrahamic religions,
Yes.
the Indian religions, etc. What all of the various paths, I think the Baha'i are right that they're all leading to the same place.
Gotcha.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're all ultimately worshiping the same oneness.
Yeah.
Right? So
back to the source.
Back to the source.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
I love it. So a mixture between political, African American identity and spirituality, right?
Yep. African world identity,
Yes.
spirituality.
Pan-Africanism.
Yeah.
Okay. Since we're
And
talking,
just human, right? Just humanism.
humanism as well. Can we, if you have any off top of your dome, can we give a taste of one of your poems?
Yeah, I do have. Well, so that's another thing about performing, and also about slam poetry that didn't interest me.
Gotcha.
I typically perform off book, right, rather than
Even
from
better.
memory.
Even better.
And I did bring my book with me, but I do have there's one poem I do have committed to memory
Yes.
that I'm happy to share.
Please.
This Too City.
Okay. Can you say the title one more time, please?
This Too City.
Okay.
A poem I wrote in the late 90s, or at least I know I started it in the late 90s, because I will revise forever.
Mm-hmm.
Just feeling the pinch of urban life, and how hard urban life is on all living things. So this too city, this too could be a night full of broken glass. If one should breathe a word, like the Spirit of God moving over blood and water running down downtown alleyways. Downtown, behind old stage doors, God dances naked on stage to keep abreast the spread of despair beneath the bright, unhappy skyline. A gesture of the hips and the wrist, saying something about human souls bleeding. God is another grease stain in asphalt, where the jaws of some formerly beloved pet grins in absolution. Under merciful steel and simonized rubber, rolling, rolling, rolling over shards of hope. That is this too city.
Love it. I love the God is another grease stain. Yeah, that line's hard right there.
That line other people react to, right?
Yeah.
That God is another grease stain in asphalt. Yes, they like that.
That's super, super dope. I had this.
And it's not meant to be disrespectful.
You have to understand the context.
You got to understand the context.
Yeah,
That's right.
And the context and what we mentioned slam poetry a couple times, right? And so I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this. I guess the way I want to phrase it is that is me personally, I don't believe that overcomplication makes things better. I'm a believer in simplicity is the answer to everything because you can connect more.
Yeah.
And going back to art being not only for me but for the community, if more people are able to understand, the better I'm able to connect.
Yeah.
So I guess my question to you is, do you think that, because sometimes people will just go, and I'm pretty sure you've been in this world and reading, for, can I say at least 50 years? Can I say that?
40.
Okay.
Which is amazing to think, but yeah. 50, 30 at least.
You've seen the variety of people writing and reading, and so would you agree that some people would try too hard to seem overly artistic, overly intelligent, as opposed to sometimes just being quote unquote simplistic is more the fruit of life?
I totally agree. I totally agree with that. That I feel like the best poetry is often quite straightforward. And the complexity builds, right? The complexity builds. I think some of that comes with experience for the poet, right? As the young poet is trying to find her voice, trying to find his voice. And part of that is mimicry, right? So mimicking other poets on your path to figuring out who you are, right, as a poet. Yeah, I totally think that some things, they can get overcomplicated, trying to sound too artistic, and then who does it communicate with? The poet who develops this very idiosyncratic system of symbols that no one can understand without a key. It's like, who are you communicating to? I haven't done it for a while, probably because we've been online mostly these last few sessions. But the last time I taught creative writing on ground, right, in the classroom, I would share with the class this comic strip by Matt Groening, right?
Okay, The Simpsons creator.
The Simpsons, but from his Life in Hell series with the bunnies, right, with the overbites.
Interesting.
And let's see, what was it called? It's called How to Be I can't remember the adjective. How to be an obscure poet or something like that, right? Or how to be a depressed, but something. How to be a something poet. I just cannot how to be
Fill
a
in the blank.
somber poet, something like that. But so he gives the steps, right? Wear somber clothing. Right?
I love it. I love it.
Right.
I love
Start poems with "Old barn, as I look at you." You know, this it's very funny. But one of the panels is create a complicated, idiosyncratic symbolism that nobody can understand but you, right?
Love it.
And of course, I'm giving it to the students as what not to do, right? Stuff, right? You know, as he's making this joke.
Yes.
Yeah, because who are you communicating to, right? And are we just talking about a form of mental masturbation that you feel really good about how smart you are and how clever and all the symbols? Or are you trying to speak to somebody, right? Are you trying to share something of your soul with others, right? So unless you're going to share a key with this complicated symbolism, make it plain. Make it plain, make it plain. People don't have trouble understanding the poetry of Langston Hughes.
Okay.
People don't have trouble, I don't think, have trouble understanding the poetry of someone like a Walt Whitman. I don't think people have trouble understanding the poetry of the poet Philip Larkin or the poet Lee Young Lee or Nikki Giovanni, who I've already mentioned, Sonia Sanchez. They speak plainly, right? You understand the language. Who are you talking to, right?
Period.
You know, make it plain. And I do keep that in mind. And really in this, I'm following the tradition of my teachers. Because of inflation's probably more, but my poetry instructor, Nettie Lynch at Mount San Antonio College back in the day, she would talk about there's no need for those $50 words in your poem. That was the 1980s. I was telling my class they're probably $500 words now, just, if you think about inflation.
I like that.
But that's the idea, right? That you don't need these big words. And if you're using these big words, just like every other word in the poem, you need to have a very specific reason for using it, right? Not you just start throwing it in there because it sounds good, right? Why are you choosing that word and what imagery does it evoke? Or because you have a bunch of these words in the poem because that's the voice of the speaker in the poem, right? This character is a professor who uses this language or something like that, right? So there needs to be something, how should I say?
Purposeful,
and it's sort of an internal logic to the language, right? To who that speaker is and the kind of language they would use. But it can work, right?
Of course.
big words can, those fancy words can work. And, sometimes it's okay if you have a word in there that people need to go look up, because it's not a bad thing to look up words, right? Build your vocabulary.
100%.
So
there's a time and a place.
There's a time and a place, exactly. Yeah. But make it plain. I'm totally with you on that.
Got you.
Make it plain.
The K.I.S.S principle.
Yeah.
Keep it simple, stupid.
There you go.
We mentioned so many poets, Nikki Giovanni, Emily Dickinson. Who are, let's say, I guess, your 3 favorite poets and or wordsmiths?
That's easy for me. And there's some great contemporary poets. So a lot of this has to do with, what I said earlier, being a reader for so long. Mm-hmm. And then also as a teacher of literature and of creative writing. Robert Frost, Langston Hughes, because they were just so meaningful to me in the earliest stage of my reading and writing of poetry. And then Emily Dickinson, Langston Hughes. Now I mentioned Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. And then I can add to that, I think I would add to that Ntozake Shange, who also was really, really critical for me at a particular point in my young life as a poet.
Okay.
As I'm trying to discover my voice, right? And I know it was very controversial at the time. I always really felt, right, vibed with for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough.
Wow.
Which she doesn't call a play as such, right? It's, it's performed in theater departments and it's very popular for monologues, for auditions, et cetera. But she did something very different with that piece, right? She said, this is not a play. This is not traditional theater. She calls it a choreo poem, combining poetry and movement. Mm-hmm. And my first encounter with it was reading it, because I had heard of it, and I remember reading about the controversy when I was in high school. As several, many black men felt that this was an attack on black men from black feminists. I never quite understood that fully, right? Because I read it, that was in high school. I'm reading about the reviews of the performances in Los Angeles in the late 70s. Early 80s, I read it for myself, and I'm really moved by the poetry of it. Mm-hmm. And I also it rings true. And I didn't see anything in it that was, generally demeaning to black men, right? There were very specific characters who were represented in the piece, but it spoke to those characters, not everybody, in my reading of it. And then I did get to see the PBS. I guess it was American Playhouse was probably the series, the American Playhouse version, which seeing it in performance, I liked it even more.
Gotcha.
So I started reading more of her stuff. So I would add Ntozake Shange to that. And I love the way she, like Langston Hughes, captured the sound of black speech in the written word, right? Through her spellings, to make sure it would be pronounced right, right? Pronounced the way black folks would write. So no G's, it's talk in, not talking. Come on, you got to get it right. Yeah. So all that, right? So those poets, Robert Frost, in no particular order, right? Gotcha. Robert Frost, Langston Hughes, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, Ntozake Shange probably have had the greatest influence on me, especially in my early period as a reader, a writer, and becoming a poet.
To this day, I love it.
To this day, yeah.
You said For Colored Girls, right? Is that the remake that Oprah did?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, they did the film version, right, for colored girls, right, based on which is, that was kind of the interesting thing, right? Okay, so it's not even a traditional play. And it's hard enough to turn a play into a movie, right? But it's a little easier because there's a narrative through line.
Yeah.
But this was different, right? So the choreo poem, it tells the stories of these women, the woman in red, the woman in orange, but so you turn that into a narrative film. Now I can't comment on the film because I didn't see it, right?
Okay.
I just didn't see it. But I do remember at the time that Ntozake Shange, still alive, she signed off on it. So I said, well, okay. That's a good sign because she would not sign off on it, right, if she wasn't pleased with it. And one of the reasons she was able to sign off on it is because she made sure that, what's his name? The director, producer, why can't I think of his name right now? Medea from New Orleans. And thank you. Why couldn't I think of his name? Yeah, Tyler Perry. She made sure that he was true to her words. And that's something that playwrights and poets enjoy. Most performances of plays or theatrical performances of poetry, you cannot change words without the permission of the writer. They do that all the time in screenwriting, as you know.
Yeah.
But playwriting, I can't remember the brother's name. He wrote the play The Meeting, right, that imagines a meeting between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. I saw him talking about that piece once, and he said, yeah, that's why I became a playwright, because I was doing screenwriting, and they change your words, but they cannot do that in the theater, right? The playwright approves any change to the language, and then I have subsequently learned that's also true of poetry when it's being performed outside of the poet performing. Don't change words without the poet's permission.
Yeah, but interesting. I heard something different about screenwriting, but I don't know because I haven't been in the industry. But maybe what I was told is that they can't necessarily change the words, but they can omit things. And I guess what your screenwriter friend is talking about is that sometimes the actors will add another word or take out something, and so I guess that's probably what he means about changing it.
No, I don't think he was talking about the actors.
Okay.
He was talking specifically about the other end of it.
Okay, like the producers?
Production. Exactly. And a lot of it might have to do with do you work for the studio or not as a screenwriter?
Yeah.
Or do you own the property?
Yeah.
Right,
how much is yours?
How much is right?
Yeah. Very true. You talked a lot about being an educator, right? So I wanted to get into the education part of your life, right? And I always get like a tug and pull with this because you said you teach creative writing. So can you really teach someone to be creative?
That's a great way of putting it. You can teach them that they are creative. Yeah.
Okay.
Because we're all, everybody's creative.
Yes.
So it's how do you unstop it, right? How do you get that flow going?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
How do you open the valve?
How do you open the valve? Exactly.
Gotcha.
And get them to recognize it. No, you too, right? You have creative capacity, right? So let's get it going.
Gotcha. And that makes me jump to another part, which is, have you seen people that have just been naturally gifted? And have you also seen, on top of that, people who were insecure, but you saw the potential and you saw that potential actually rain through after a little bit of tweaking?
Yes. I've seen just some incredibly gifted young poets come through my class. Embrace the exercises, embrace the community, right? Because the classes run as a workshop model, right? That we're giving each other feedback. It's in that interplay, right, that we improve as writers. And you're only competing against yourself, right? Who you were when you came into this class, the writer you are when you're leaving the class, right? That's your only competition. How are you getting better? I've also seen students who are quite talented, and in some ways feel like they're too talented, right, for the room.
Oh, arrogance.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Because, you can't, there isn't a control for who's coming in, right? So people are coming in at different levels.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so you don't want to work with these people because, you feel you're so good. But instead of seeing that you have something to share with these folks and to help bring them out. So I've seen that too, right? So the person who feels they're above it, maybe they think they're better than other people in the class.
Yeah.
Could have gotten more out of the class, the kind of model they could have been, and just didn't, right? Just, lived in their own arrogance, came to class when they felt like they could and all that, right? And it's like, okay, that's your role. And then the other, like the very beginner, right, who discovers that I can do this, right? I can do this. I have something to say, and now I have a way to say it, right? Okay. And things to fall back on, techniques. If I'm like, oh, how do I go about doing this? I can use this technique that I learned in this class to get me going, right? So
I love it. Have you, and I'm pretty sure you have, what would you say the difference is between a student who is talented, you see the talent and you see them shine forth, and a student who is talented, but they don't shine forth?
Interesting.
Same student, but different directions.
Well, it depends, right? And I'm thinking about the student who doesn't shine forth.
Yes.
It depends, right? For some students, it's priorities, right? Where's your priority? Are you willing to put in the work? Mm-hmm. Are you willing to bring the material to get the feedback, make the changes?
Okay.
So there's that person who isn't shining through, but primarily because they're just not putting in the effort. Now, there could be reasons for that, right? Whatever's happening in private life, home, whatever. There's the other one who, and is actually the easier student to deal with in a lot of ways, who isn't shining through. You can see the talent, but they lack the confidence, right? Mm-hmm. And I completely understand that because of my own bouts with is it good enough? Yeah. I don't want to be mediocre. Yeah. Right? So, which doesn't go away, right? That constant, but also take as a good thing, right? Because you want to be better. So who needs the feedback, right? The appreciation of you've got a talent here. And here, let me show you. Let me not just tell you. Let me show you. Let's look at this thing that you wrote, right? See, this, how unique this idea is, right? And putting these two images together, right? Who would have thought of that, right? Exactly. But they, kind of needing to hear that. And then this is what's so important about bringing your work to the class to get feedback. Mm-hmm. Because you're not just getting it from me, right? The other members of the class are giving you that feedback. That was really good. And even if I think you might want to try this, but that was really good, right? And that builds, so I've seen that, right? That the difference between week one of the semester, the student who is very nervous about sharing. Everybody has to share. Very nervous about sharing. Reading in low tones.
Okay. What does that mean?
Well, we can barely hear them.
Got you.
Right? Got almost a whisper.
Got you.
But then, by the end of the semester, right, that you can see that confidence, right? They're fully enunciating, volunteering to read. recognizing that there's no need for embarrassment, right? Because I tell them, this is a workshop class.
Yeah.
Don't bring your polished stuff to show off, right? This is not what this is for. I mean, you can bring anything that you want, you want feedback on because you're trying to improve it, including the new stuff that that you generate in this class, because as I tell the class, one of my goals as the instructor is to help you generate new material, right? So
I love it.
And I'm seeing everything is in progress. So at the end of the semester, I don't care about whether you have finished pieces as such. I'm going to comment on it as if you're going to do another revision anyway, right? Which I do in all my classes, right? Even if this is the graded one, I'm still commenting as if you're going to revise, because you can use this for the next class, the next paper, or whatever, right? This kind of feedback. So other folks are giving you feedback and telling you how much they like it, and oh, that's so good. And so that, right, that positive reinforcement helps those students shine.
Gotcha. Man, I got 2 questions. Try to remember 2 of them. Okay, so the first one that I wanted to ask was, can you give us all like a simple way to be a better creative writer?
Yeah. Very simple. Not unique to me or original to me. It's really the cardinal rule of writing, and really all writing, but especially poetry and fiction. Very simple. Show, don't tell. Show, don't tell. John went down the street, tells the story. John skipped down the street. John ambled down the street. John crawled down the street. All these various ways that John can get down the street shows how John gets down the street, rather than telling that John went down the street, right? So visual language, and I shouldn't restrict it to the visual, sensual language, sense language, right? Language that appeals to all 5 of the senses. Show it, don't tell it. Number 1 rule.
So would an example be the cat drank milk? That would be telling?
Yeah. I mean, it could show, but the cat sipped milk.
Yeah, or slurped milk. Would that be
slurped milk?
Would that be more of a showing? Okay.
Exactly.
The cat devoured the milk.
Much more visual. Exactly.
Devoured it under a second. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, awesome. You mentioned that you always give revisions, even if they're going to the next class. And you said, I think you even said you've revisioned your poem, The Two City, I believe.
Yeah.
So my question is a piece ever finished in your eyes?
That's a great question. Yes. For different reasons. For the reason of the editor, you got to get this in, right? If we have a deadline, we got a due date, you got to get this in. So there's that version of it.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean you can't go back to it and create other versions of the poem or the piece. As we see, like with the theatrical release, and then 10 years later, there's the director's version, right?
Yeah.
So an example, a poem that I got published in 97 or 98, I think, called Safer Sex. And that was a deadline thing, right? So, I want to get the poem in. I wanted to get it published in the Pacific Review that comes out of Cal-State San Bernardino. And so I got it in. It was published. I'm happy with that. I've read that version, but I wasn't completely happy with it. So I continued to revise it. And there's a new version in Black Dot Clubhouse, but it isn't exactly the same. So I retitled it Safer Sex Reprise. And then with a note that, it's published in this other version in another book, with some slight differences. And the reprise is just a little bit longer, a little bit more on the ending of it. So in some sense, No, you can continue to revise, because even when I'm doing readings, I'm thinking, oh, I could have said that instead, or I could have written that instead. Well, it's published now,
Yeah.
but I still might revisit it. So I can see continuing to work on a piece for as long as it continues to be interesting.
Got you. So it's yes and no for
It's
you.
yes and no. Yeah.
Okay.
Depends on the piece, I guess. Yeah.
It depends on the piece. You know, as we've been growing along and hip hop has been becoming more allowed into the academic culture with like Tupac classes, Micah 9 teaching, Bun B teaching. Is there a similarity between hip hop and poetry to you, and why or why not?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, most obviously in the form, right? So much hip hop rhymes. And now, not poetry doesn't always rhyme, but I mean that's just a real obvious poetic feature of a lot of hip hop, right? Or at least the art of the MC, the rhymes, right? Again, the show don't tell, the visual language. The oral part of it, and I thought that was a great, how should I say, boon for poetry, and really sort of this kind of double thing. The emergence of hip hop, and going back to the late '80s, right? The emergence of hip hop, particularly in the States, particularly for Black poets, put a kind of pressure on poets. You know, these MCs are bringing it. Y'all, what is this, right? You need to bring it a little more, right? And so I think there was some pressure put on to be more performative.
Okay.
Not so academic. And I might be assuming too much about the ways in which poets were reciting at the time. But I have I remember a friend from high school who's also a poet, Adwin David Brown. I remember him at the time, right? He had started incorporating music into his poetry, right? And it was absolutely, and he said, yeah, man, this, hip hop, right, has put this pressure on
all of us.
Okay. And so I thought that was a good thing, actually, that, this is forcing poets to think about, their performance, how you're going to move the crowd, basically, right?
Step up their game.
So that was a good thing, I think. That performativity, I guess, they share. The show don't tell aspect in the best of it in both genres.
Yes.
Certainly the rhyme, right? The wordplay, right? The wordplay. I think MCs are poets.
I agree.
Right?
I agree.
So
I agree. I think the really cool part about, like what you're saying about hip hop was making the poets step up their game. I think that's a good thing, because I think that's the whole thing about art and life and creativity is just like, okay, wow, we have to take it to the next level and the next level and the next level, right? And I'm actually really glad to hear that a lot of hip hop has been making it into the academia world.
Yeah.
And speaking of, we've been talking about academia, and you're currently working on your PhD, correct?
Yes, I'm smack dab in the middle of writing my dissertation.
Okay, can you talk to us a little bit about what it is and what it's about?
Yeah, the dissertation, it's called Excavating from the Inside Out, Excavating the Performing Arts Society of Los Angeles. So what the work is looking to do is situate that group, right? The Performing Arts Society of Los Angeles, founded by Van Tuyl Whitfield, who had already had a career in theater and the entertainment industry. Founded in South Los Angeles, the old Balboa Theater on Vermont, like Vermont and Manchester.
Okay.
The year after the 1965 Watts Uprising, and very directly in response to the uprising, right? As a way, and really just one of many similar formations that were founded in that year as a response to the uprising. Well, the motto, right? The slogan of PASLA, Performing Arts Society of Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure I get it right. Social development through the performing arts.
Okay.
And that was their idea, right? That
Can you explain that a little bit? Social development.
Social development.
Okay.
By putting this artistic institution right smack dab in the middle of the ghetto, in the, what was it called? The Watts curfew area.
Do you know why it was called the Watts curfew area?
Well, because during the uprising, it's the area, which of course was actually much larger than Watts itself. It was the area that was put under curfew during the running street battles and whatnot.
Gotcha.
Right? So the idea was to offer classes, right, for personal development, and through that personal development, developing the community as folks in the community, children and adults and everybody in between, could tap into their inner worlds, right, through the acting classes or the music classes or dance classes, could learn, I guess, what we could call marketable skills, but we could also call nation-building skills through learning things like, set design, stage lighting, animation. So one of the instructors there was the first black animator hired by Disney, Mr. Braxton. I went blank on his first name, so I'm just going to call him Mr. Braxton. The several filmmakers who would very shortly after be associated with the UCLA L.A. Rebellion School, like Haile Garima, Larry Clark, teaching film classes there. So this was the idea, right, that through engaging the arts, presenting productions, right, for the community.
Yeah.
And I think quite importantly for me, the content of the material, right, being produced by black artists with a black audience in mind. So instead of putting on an all-black version of, say, a Shakespeare play or a play by American playwright Arthur Miller, you're putting on plays that are being written in the Watts Writers Workshop, or that are being created right there at PASLA, or from playwrights who are part of the Black Arts movement. So one of the things I'm doing is situating PASLA in its historical moment within the Black Arts movement.
This is the original FUBU.
The original FUBU, that's right.
The For Us, By Us.
For Us, By Us, exactly, through the arts, right? Now, the Black Arts movement, it doesn't appear as a movement out of whole cloth. It's a continuation and a picking up of the tradition coming out of the Harlem Renaissance.
Okay.
Now there's about a 30-year gap between what we might call the end of the Harlem Renaissance and the beginning of the Black Arts movement. So it's not like there wasn't anything going on in that time, but I think those two moments really stand out as this very intentional moment of FUBU moment. This very intentional black art for black audiences. And the writer Sam Greenlee, poet, novelist, the writer of his best known work is The Spook Who Sat by the Door.
Okay.
And in an interview, he talks about it, right? He talks about knowing who his audience is. Working class black people, not even bougie black people, right? Working class black people, and this was the audience.
Smart.
As many of the artists of the Black arts movement imagined their audience, the everyday black folks in the hood. So a lot of street theater, right, was a part of that, right? Black folks don't necessarily have a tradition of coming to the theater.
Facts.
So let's take the theater to them, right, and do these, these street performances. Los Angeles, New York, Newark, New Orleans. I mean, so this was a national thing, and there are international versions of it. I
had a quick question.
Yeah.
Do you, and it's a little side note to it, do you think that Black Americans are still doing FUBU today, or you think it has kind of waned away?
That's a both answer. Okay. Also, I think that yes, they are, and in fact, you anticipate one of the arguments I'm making in my dissertation, or I'm going to make, that indeed there's still what we might call an ecosystem of community arts that is still there with that very specific goal, creating art for a working class Black public, but that the pressure to and a pressure, I think, specifically put on Black artists to be more quote unquote universal in our approach and our audience. But specifically, I think, because if you are too specifically Black and Black focused, that's seen as a threat. Somehow that is threatening to the powers that be.
You become militant all of a sudden.
You become militant, right? Yeah. If you just want to focus on Black people. Now, mind you, there are like 1 billion Black people in the world. That's not a small group of people to be focusing on. But it is often, I think, by mainstream academy, mainstream art world, that somehow that's limiting. Now,
it won't have a global market.
A white writer rarely is going to, there's an assumption already that that's somehow universal when it isn't, right? So I think an example of that, a really well celebrated, greatly celebrated playwright, and he deserves it. August Wilson, for his Pittsburgh cycle, right? Now, when August Wilson was alive and writing these plays, one of the mainstream criticisms of him was he's too focused on Black people. He should write plays about other people just so he can demonstrate, the universality of it. I'm like, why does he need to do that? I'm one of those persons of the opinion that we find the universal in our specific stories, right? By telling you my specific story, whoever you are, you can recognize our common humanity. I don't need a Chinese writer somewhere to be thinking about me specifically. He can write about his Chinese life in China. It's a human life. Yeah. I can make that connection. I just this past fall, I taught some classical Greek tragedies. The students were able to identify with these characters, right, that are being written about from Greek mythology. But, there's human drama going on, right? So they can identify. So I'm a great proponent of write what you know.
I like that.
And the universal is already in there, right? If you're telling a human story, then other humans, regardless of their background, are gonna connect with that. Whatever the superficiality, right, of the cultural layer, right, the deep humanity comes through. And that's what I think, that is exactly, I think, the project of the the Harlem Renaissance writers and other artists, because it wasn't just the literary arts, and the artists of the Black arts movement, literary and otherwise, telling these very specific stories to a very specific audience, and that other people will recognize the humanity. And in fact, part of the project was to reveal that humanity, which is so often distorted by mainstream media, right? So here are the real humans. And like Langston Hughes put it, in our beauty and in our ugliness. And if white people like it or don't like it, fine. And if black people like it or don't like it, fine, right? We got to tell our stories.
Period.
He says it much more eloquently.
I'm with you. I got you.
But that's his point, right? Here it is.
Awesome. And what would you like the world to learn and understand from your dissertation once it's all finished?
Well, one thing I want them to know is that there was an institution called the Performing Arts Society of Los Angeles. And some incredible artists came through that institution. That institution laid a foundation, set a model for institutions that have come up subsequently, even if they didn't know about the Performing Arts Society of Los Angeles, which I've discovered in my research. Just the kind of, hey, have you heard of? No, I'd never heard of that. And I had never heard of it growing up. I knew about the Inner City Cultural Center, and they were basically like sibling institutions,
Gotcha.
Even though their projects were a little different, actually quite different, but they worked together. But I didn't know about the Performing Arts Society of Los Angeles, even though it was in the neighborhood, and though I knew some of the actors who came through it. So I want people to know, for example, Gita Hadi, Nathaniel Taylor, the actor who played Rollo in the Sanford and Son series from the 70s into the very early 80s. He was a member of the Performing Arts Society of Los Angeles. He was so much more than that character Rollo. And he is very much the inspiration for the dissertation, meeting him, talking to him, learning about P.A.S.L.A. And when I had the revelation that this is what I need to do my dissertation on, the Performing Arts Society of Los Angeles, people don't know these stories.
So you
He
met
was
him
such an
before
incredible, yeah.
You met him before the dissertation.
I met him before the dissertation.
Wow.
I met him before the dissertation. He was retired by then. But I still got to see him perform. Readers Theater that he was doing. So he continued after his career in Hollywood, which he gave up in the 1980s because of his dissatisfaction with the industry, with the kinds of roles black people were still getting in the 1980s.
Yeah.
But he didn't give up on teaching, right? On teaching acting, on teaching set design. I mean, they're just an incredibly skilled person. Another person who just recently passed that was a member of P.A.S.L.A, Jean F. King, who actually, after her years in P.A.S.L.A, went on to become a family and marriage therapist.
Okay.
And actually, and my hesitation was, did she only do that? She might have also done like individual, clinical counseling.
Yeah.
But before, and that was like a second path in her life. Because previous to that, she was in the art world, in the jazz world, right? Cool. She knew everybody. I actually met her before I met Gita Hadi Taylor. I didn't even know they knew each other, even though I knew them both at the same time.
Wow.
I know it was just one of those weird things where a friend of mine who knew her and was taking my Afro-American Lit class happened to say, I have a friend, she knew Langston Hughes. I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah, she knew about these people. Would you like her to come to class? Yeah, absolutely.
Please?
Right?
Yeah.
So she came and she talked. She talked about it. Oh, yeah, I knew we knew Langston Hughes. And yeah, I knew John Coltrane and Miles Davis because she was in that milieu.
Wow.
Her husband was a jazz musician in that milieu. She herself had been in the arts business, right? So that like first part of her life, she was a member of PASLA, the Performing Arts Society. And I am profoundly moved by the family that the PASLA players created. So that all these years, and the Performing Arts Society had a long run, unlike a lot of its contemporaries that were closed within 10 years. PASLA was able to like make it a good 30 years, I think, or at least close to 30 years, 1966 to 95 or 96. And folks remained close that entire time. That when I realized that I knew Gene, who knew Gita Hadi, so I was like, look, Gene, can I talk to you about your time in PASLA? She was able to reach out to members. This young man, young to her, right, is doing research on PASLA, and they were delighted to know that somebody was doing it. It's like it's falling from memory, and it should not fall from memory. Motojiko, Vantile Whitfield, the founder, and then he gives everybody African names. So Gita Hadi, Dahabu Lucian Smith, Imsha, and Changa, Charlene, and Johnny Weathers. A lot of these people are still here. Gita Hadi Taylor passed a few years back. Gene just passed this month. That's the generation they are, though, right? We're losing people. Vantile, I think I have to look back at my notes, but I think he passed in the late 90s or the early 2000s.
Yep.
So this generation is passing away, and PASLA was, I think, such a vital institution. So many actors came through it. So many musicians got training there. So many filmmakers.
Yeah.
That people need to know about it, and they don't know about it. So if nothing else, I want the dissertation to leave a record.
Definitely.
Of the Performing Arts Society of Los Angeles.
That is super awesome. Thank you for that. Thank you
You're
for
welcome.
that work. It's super amazing. Preserving the culture, preserving the history. Otherwise, it probably would have disappeared. It's probably a godsend. You know, a poet being a poet/historian.
Yeah, as it's turning out.
Yeah, it's super awesome. Yusef, what besides obviously this big project, what other current projects are you working on, if there are any?
Well, that's the biggest one right now, and I'm really in the stretch run because I want to be finished with the dissertation in April, so I don't have to take summer class session, and I'll be done. The other main thing I'm doing besides that is the Joko Collective, right? I am a member of the Joko Collective, a grassroots educational project based in Los Angeles, South Los Angeles, founded by my partner, Tasha Thomas, who then invited me and others in to work with her. And how can I put this as simple as possible? She saw a deficit in some critical thinking around
South Central?
Well, not South Central exclusively, but around different, how should I say, theories or ideas being promoted as paths to liberation.
Okay, can you give an example?
And a very specific example, and maybe you've heard this, the ideas of sovereign citizenship, and whether or not when we go into a courtroom, whether that's under maritime law, and so they don't necessarily have jurisdiction because that flag has fringes on it, and so this sort of thing, and who does and doesn't have to pay taxes. And she was just like, they're the Illuminati are running everything, right? All these types of things.
Okay.
Yeah. So she's like, well, okay, let's take them at face value, and then let's do some research on them, right? Just say, what are the sources of these ideas? Are they indigenous to the Black radical tradition, or are they coming from outside? And can we vet these, right? Since they're being promoted as paths to freedom, because there are holes in lots of these, right? Yeah. And so, are they going to be helpful to us, and especially if they're coming from what are ultimately our enemies, right? And indeed, a lot of these things are created as a reaction to our push for freedom, like the commie, or what do they call it, the posse comitatus and the sovereign citizenship, that only certain people are real citizens of the United States, and these other folks, meaning us, meaning Latinx folks, meaning new immigrants coming in, especially non-white immigrants, are somehow aren't real citizens in the same way. So she was like, no, we need to examine this stuff and not take it at face value just because it sounds good or it's oppositional to the mainstream. And so it's okay. Not everything, just, what do they say? The enemy of my enemy is my friend? Not necessarily, right?
Okay.
That's the idea, right? So can we vet that? So that was that was her impetus. I went, and Joko is a word that means sit down, as in let's sit down and hash this out.
Gotcha.
Right. A term recommended to her when she shared the idea with her Babalawo, right, her Ifa tradition spiritual advisor.
Okay.
And he recommended the word Joko, a Yoruba word meaning sit down, with the idea of let's have a sit down. We can talk this out, right? Yeah. Or deliberate. And so, Tasha was very clear, right? This is not a venue for debate where there are these two sides and somebody's trying to win. This is about deliberation. How can we break this thing down to get to a deeper understanding of the processes and then move forward from there? And then also she imagined it as a collection of what she called the learning and the learned. So some folks, scholars with degrees, self-taught scholars, right? But that demonstrate this dedication to this critical process. And that's who she brought in. So folks like me with degrees, but a community focus, and other folks who are just that, self-taught. Try to get, multi-generational, and we are multi-generational. We've had, many people come in and out, take breaks from it. Tasha is the heart. Since I've been invited in, I've been consistent, right? So that's been really the other major project. We must be 7 years on now of doing Joko. Try to address, some of these, certain topical issues when they come up, and issues that we can look at, take a deeper dive into over a period of a couple of meetings, because we typically only have what we call the public Joko once a month, typically. But then we have our planning Jokos, our own internal process, where we do the same thing, where, challenge ideas around, various things out there.
Yeah.
Issues of contention, say around vaccines, for example.
Okay.
Just as one example, or the COVID information, right? And so let's bring in the different sides, and can we see everybody's evidence, and talk this out instead of being in our camps and back and forth.
Which is very healthy.
This is the idea, right?
Yeah.
This is the idea, to create a healthy
dialogue,
intellectual environment in the community. And again, with the real idea being for the grassroots community.
Yeah.
Not conversation of intellectuals among intellectuals for intellectuals, right?
Gotcha.
But how do we reach the grassroots community? Before the pandemic, we were able to do the public Jokos at a FEBA center. I forget the number of the fire station, but it was an old fire station that had been turned into a community center in Los Angeles. Conflict with the city council member of that district. Once the pandemic hit, couldn't use it, no gathering in public places.
Yeah. Yep.
And that council member took advantage of that gap to kind of lock the folks out who were administrating it. FEBA was administrating it. African Firefighters and Benevolent Association was the name of the organization that was using the place. FEBA, which also means something. It's also a Yoruba word, I think, and it means, I forget what it means though. Something related that might mean like friendly or something like that. Something like that. So we transitioned, right? Since we could no longer do it on ground, we transitioned to Zoom. Which allowed us, there was a benefit to the Zoom because now we were able to include people from the East Coast, from the Midwest, from the UK, from Colombia, to participate in the conversations, which we wanted to do because we're thinking internationally, not
broader
just locally.
reach.
Exactly. Now we're trying to figure out a way to do both, right? As things are opening back up, get back on ground, but also maintain the online presence so we can continue to have that farther reach.
Oh, and that can easily be done.
It can
easily done. Super amazing work. Thank you for doing that as well. That's super cool. Yoko, right?
Joko.
Yoko's
yes.
John Lennon's wife. Yeah.
Spelled the same except with a J.
Yeah, that one. Don't forget it, guys.
And the official name, Joko Collective, is who we are.
Okay.
Yeah, the Joko Collective. You can we have a YouTube channel, so you can actually watch some of the older or more recent, I should say, Joko sessions. Joko Collective is the channel, and you can also find us on Facebook. There's a Joko Collective page, but it's part of the Tasha Thomas page. So
okay. So Yusef, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Let's say 100 years pass by, 250 years pass by. What would you like your empire to look like? Whether that's academically, lifestyle, political impact, global impact. What would you like your empire to have looked like?
That's a really interesting question. I would hope. Well, for just personally, that my work, my poetry, is being taught in schools, that somebody found it worthy enough that generations should know about it and continue reading it. So that's one thing. 100 years, 250 years, 500 years, right? They're still reading my poetry. And then that was my mark of success as a poet when I was 18. If people think you're worth teaching to generations that come after, that's good enough. Now, outside of myself, I hope by then there's a just world, that there is still a world, that we have not burned the planet to a crisp, either through climate change or nuclear war, and that we have achieved some version of the Star Trek universe. Because in the Star Trek universe, ain't nobody starving, right? And everybody's housed. And in fact, all basic and even beyond basic needs are taken care of so that the citizens of the Federation can pursue their interest. They don't have to worry about the hustle, right? They can pursue their interests. So if they want to go into physics, they can go into physics. If they want to become carpenters, they can become carpenters.
Yeah.
And got to worry about how they're going to eat the next day, where they're going to sleep the next day. Humans are going to be humans. So I'm assuming that, a lot of this emotional stuff that we all deal with, that ain't going nowhere soon, right? That's so much of what makes us human, which is why, part of the reason science fiction that takes place so far into the future is still recognizably human, because the characters are still recognizably human. Mm-hmm. So that's the universe I would hope for. That's the empire I would hope for. An empire of justice, balance, harmony, people working to maintain that harmony, because it does take constant vigilance.
Yep.
And that's our duty, right? That's our role as human beings, is to maintain the balance of the world. And that people are still reading my work.
I love it. I love it. And so I'm assuming you're a Trekkie at heart?
No, not at heart. That's no. I would not think of myself as a Trekkie. I mean, I could probably be called a Trekkie, but I don't think of myself as a Trekkie.
Okay.
But I love the Star Trek. I love the Star Trek series. My favorite is Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I'm more of a Tolkien nerd and a Middle Earth nerd than Trekkie.
Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings, yes, and really pre-Lord of the Rings. I'm all about the First Age and the Second Age, the Silmarillion, more than the Lord of the Rings, which was published after the Lord of the Rings.
Interesting.
But it gives all the prehistory that when I was reading The Hobbit and reading The Lord of the Rings, and all these references that would be made to this in the First Age and this in the Second Age, and this is when the Rings of Power were made, right? In the Second Age. So I'm like, oh man, I would love to. That sounds so interesting. So when I learned about the Silmarillion, which tells the story of the First Age and the Second Age, I was all over that. I read it all in one night.
Wow.
Then I read it again the next night.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm much more of a Middle Earth geek than a Trekkie.
So Tolkien is not overrated?
Not to me.
Okay. Okay.
My humble opinion, though, right?
I love it.
And of course, I am biased.
There we go.
So
I love the honesty.
Yeah.
I love the honesty. Yusef, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Can you please tell everybody where they could find you, how they can see your work, how they can collab with you, how they can find the Joko space, and et cetera,
I will tell them all
Just
that.
let them all that stuff.
And you're very welcome. Thank you for having me on the podcast. This was great. You can find me on Instagram over there.
That camera.
Yusef Doucet on Instagram, and Doucet, Doucet. Yusef is spelled with Yusef. So Yusef Doucet on Instagram. You can find me on Twitter at John Brown Brigade. No E on Brigade. I don't know why. When I was coming up with the name, they didn't let me add the E, so I guess there was a limit, right? But at John Brown Brigade, that's my Twitter handle. You can find us on, I mentioned the Facebook. Now, it isn't my page. Again, Tasha Thomas, and then she created a page for Joko Collective, and it was really supposed to be the Joko Collective page, but I guess she had to put her name in before she could create the Joko Collective page. So if you can't find Joko Collective on Facebook directly, go to Tasha Thomas, and then you'll find Joko Collective. And then we have our YouTube. YouTube, Joko Collective on YouTube. You can find me there. Email, Yusef Doucet. No, I'm giving too much information. yusefdou. yusefdou @gmail.com. You can contact me there. I think those are all. I'm actually on LinkedIn too, but quite honestly, I never check my LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. I need to check it when I get home today, because I know I got a ton of messages. People are waiting to hear from me.
Piled up.
It has.
Got you. So there it is, folks. I'll have everything also in the description. Great interview. We learned a lot about, the dissertation, poetry, tricks on learning creativity, show, don't tell, right? And so much more. So I want to thank you guys all, along with Yusef, for being on the podcast. Please like the video, subscribe, share. We appreciate everybody for their work. Again, my name's Antonio D. Miles, the one and the only, the real one, not the phony. You know what I mean? And so other than that, we will catch you guys in the next one. All right?
Thank you.
Peace.
Peace.
I say it's my duty. Yeah. Is it my will? Yeah. To do what? Yeah. To do is right. I say.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
That
so
was
much.
a lot of fun.